Miss Marple and the Wedding at Rosewood Hall.
Chapter 1. The Invitation to Rosewood Hall. There were few things Miss Marple enjoyed more than a peaceful morning in the garden. The roses behind her little cottage in St. Mary Mead had reached their finest bloom. Pink, white and crimson flowers nodded gently in the warm June breeze, while bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom. Miss Marple knelt beside a flower bed, carefully removing a troublesome weed that had found its way among the lavender. "It is always the smallest things that cause the greatest trouble," she murmured to herself with a faint smile. "People are rather like gardens in that respect." She rose slowly, brushing the soil from her gloves, when the familiar sound of the village postman's bicycle echoed along the lane. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Thomas. You've quite a collection today." He handed her several letters before tipping his cap and riding away. Miss Marple carried the post indoors and placed it neatly upon her small dining table. Most of the envelopes contained ordinary matters, charity appeals, village newsletters, and a bill from the grocer. One envelope, however, immediately caught her attention. It was thick cream paper with elegant handwriting she recognized at once. Mrs. Eleanor Finch. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Eleanor had been one of her closest friends for over 30 years. They had first met while organizing a church fete, and although Eleanor had later moved to the village of Ashcombe, they had remained faithful correspondents. Miss Marple carefully opened the envelope with her letter knife. Inside was a beautifully written invitation. "My dear Jane, you simply must come. My granddaughter Lucy is to be married at Rosewood Hall on Saturday next, and nothing would delight me more than having you beside me on such a happy occasion. It promises to be the largest wedding our village has seen in years. Family members are arriving from every corner of the country. Old friends are gathering once again, and Rosewood Hall has never looked more beautiful. I confess, however, that large family gatherings always make me a little nervous. Perhaps age has made me suspicious, or perhaps experience has taught me that whenever too many relatives meet under one roof, old disagreements are never very far behind. Do come. With affection, Eleanor." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. The final sentence lingered in her mind. Old disagreements. She had attended enough weddings to know that joy and tension often travelled together. Weddings reunited people who had spent years avoiding one another. Forgotten arguments suddenly returned. Old romances reappeared. Family pride became wounded over the smallest matters. Human nature, she reflected, rarely took holidays. By Thursday afternoon, she was travelling through the rolling English countryside aboard a quiet train. Golden fields stretched towards distant woods, while sheep grazed peacefully beneath clear blue skies. Across from her sat a cheerful elderly gentleman who spent most of the journey describing his prize pigeons. Miss Marple listened politely. She had long ago discovered that people usually revealed far more than they intended, simply by talking about subjects they loved. When the train finally reached Ashcombe Station, Eleanor herself stood waiting on the platform. "My dear Jane, Eleanor." The two ladies embraced warmly. "You haven't changed at all," Eleanor declared. "My mirror would strongly disagree." They laughed together. Waiting beside Eleanor was a young man loading luggage into a motor car. "This is my grandson Peter," Eleanor explained. Peter greeted Miss Marple politely, though his smile seemed rather forced. "You've arrived just in time," he said. "Rosewood Hall has become wonderfully chaotic." "That sounds exactly as a wedding house should," Miss Marple replied. As they drove through the village, colourful bunting fluttered between cottages. The florist's windows overflowed with white roses and lilies. Children chased one another carrying ribbons while villagers discussed the approaching celebration with obvious excitement. "Everyone seems delighted," observed Miss Marple. "They are," Eleanor replied. "Lucy has always been loved here." "And the bridegroom?" "Daniel Harper, a pleasant young architect from London, quiet, sensible, perhaps a little serious." Peter glanced briefly towards his grandmother before returning his attention to the road. "He has certainly had plenty to cope with this week." Eleanor gave him a warning look. "Peter, I've said nothing wrong." Miss Marple noticed the exchange but asked no questions. Rosewood Hall soon appeared beyond ancient oak trees. The great country house stood proudly upon a gentle rise, its warm stone walls glowing in the afternoon sunshine. Gardeners hurried between flower beds, servants carried boxes through the front entrance, florists arranged enormous displays of white roses along the stone steps. The entire house seemed alive with activity. Inside, every room buzzed with conversation. Guests greeted relatives they had not seen for years. Children laughed as they ran through long corridors. Somewhere upstairs, someone practiced a wedding hymn on the piano. Lucy herself descended the staircase carrying a bundle of invitations. She was beautiful without appearing vain, with bright eyes and an easy smile. "Grandmother," she embraced Eleanor before turning towards Miss Marple. "You must be Miss Marple. Grandmother speaks of you constantly. I hope only kindly, always kindly." Daniel Harper joined them a few moments later. He was handsome in a reserved sort of way, though Miss Marple noticed something curious. Whenever another guest mentioned tomorrow's wedding, Daniel smiled, yet the smile never quite reached his eyes. He looked tired, not physically tired, burdened. Before Miss Marple could consider the matter further, another gentleman entered the hall. Tall, silver-haired, and impressively dressed, he carried himself with effortless authority. "My brother Arthur," Eleanor said quietly. Arthur Bellamy greeted everyone courteously, yet there was something distant about him. He shook hands firmly but never lingered. Several relatives appeared eager to please him. Others carefully avoided conversation altogether. Within minutes, Miss Marple observed 3 separate people watching Arthur rather than speaking to him. An interesting little pattern. Later that afternoon, tea was served upon the terrace overlooking the gardens. Conversation flowed easily enough until a young woman hurried across the lawn. "I'm terribly sorry I'm late." She kissed Eleanor affectionately. "My granddaughter Emily," Eleanor explained. "She returned from Canada only last month." Emily smiled warmly, though Arthur Bellamy's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "So," he said evenly, "you finally decided to come home." Emily answered with equal calm. "I thought Lucy deserved that much." No one spoke for several seconds. Then someone quickly changed the subject. Miss Marple stirred her tea quietly. Most people believed silence revealed nothing. She had found precisely the opposite. As evening approached, the wedding photographer arrived, carrying several large camera cases. He introduced himself pleasantly enough and began photographing decorations around the hall. Yet Miss Marple noticed something odd. Instead of looking at flowers or arranging lighting, he seemed more interested in studying the guests themselves. His eyes lingered upon faces rather than scenery. He appeared to recognize people before they introduced themselves, a curious habit. Dinner proved cheerful on the surface. There was laughter, champagne, stories from childhood, plans for tomorrow's ceremony. Yet beneath the pleasant conversation, tiny moments disturbed the harmony. Arthur quietly left the table twice to answer telephone calls. Daniel accidentally dropped his wine glass when someone mentioned financial matters. Emily received a folded note from a servant, read it, and immediately slipped it into her pocket. Peter and another cousin argued softly near the library before pretending nothing had happened. None of these incidents appeared particularly important. Individually, they meant almost nothing. Together, however, Miss Marple had spent too many years observing ordinary life to ignore such small threads. Late that evening, Eleanor joined her beside an upstairs window overlooking the moonlit gardens. "I expect I'm imagining things," Eleanor admitted. "What sort of things?" "I wanted this wedding to bring everyone together. And instead," Eleanor sighed, "it feels rather as though everyone has brought old troubles with them." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Eleanor, families are wonderfully alike wherever one goes. They forgive very slowly, remember everything, and insist they have forgotten nothing." Eleanor laughed softly. "You always know exactly what to say. I only repeat what life has taught me." Down below, someone crossed the gardens carrying a lantern. Another figure briefly appeared among the hedges before disappearing into the darkness. Miss Marple watched silently. Perhaps it was merely a servant finishing the day's work. Perhaps. Yet as she closed the curtains, she could not quite dismiss the feeling that beneath the joyful preparations, Rosewood Hall was waiting for something far less happy than a wedding. And somewhere within the house, a secret patiently waited for its moment to emerge. Chapter 2. Murder Before the First Dance. The morning of the wedding opened bright and golden over Rosewood Hall. Sunlight poured across the lawns, turning the dew upon the grass into tiny points of silver. Gardeners moved quickly between the flower beds, giving last attention to roses, lilies, and white ribbons tied along the pathway. From the open windows came the sound of servants hurrying, doors closing, voices calling, and somewhere far away in the house, a young bridesmaid crying because her satin shoe had gone missing. Miss Marple, already dressed in a soft grey gown with a lace collar, stood by her bedroom window and looked out across the gardens. It was a perfect day for a wedding. That, she reflected, was sometimes a pity. Bad weather gave people something harmless to complain about. Sunshine forced them to notice one another. A light knock sounded at her door. "Come in," said Miss Marple. Eleanor entered, looking elegant in pale blue, though her face showed signs of a restless night. "Jane, do tell me honestly, do I look like a proud grandmother or a frightened sheep?" Miss Marple considered her kindly. "You look like a lady who has tried to arrange a wedding while managing a family. That is much worse than a frightened sheep." "Yes, dear, much worse." Eleanor laughed, but only briefly. She walked to the dressing table and touched the edge of a silver hairbrush without using it. "I found another note this morning." Miss Marple turned at once. "Where?" "Under Lucy's bedroom door." Eleanor took a folded paper from her sleeve and handed it over. The message was written in plain block letters. "Do not marry into lies." Miss Marple read it twice. "Who has seen this?" "Only Lucy, myself, and now you. Lucy insists it is some cruel joke. She is determined not to let it spoil the day." "A very sensible attitude," said Miss Marple, "though sensible attitudes do not always make danger disappear." Eleanor lowered her voice. "Jane, do you think someone means to hurt her?" Miss Marple folded the note carefully. "I think someone means to frighten her. Whether that person also means to do more, we cannot yet say." Before Eleanor could reply, hurried footsteps sounded in the corridor. Lucy appeared at the doorway, flushed but smiling bravely. "Grandmother, the flowers for the church have arrived, but Aunt Beatrice says the lilies are too strong, and Daniel cannot find his cufflinks, and Emily has disappeared again." "Again?" asked Miss Marple gently. Lucy looked slightly embarrassed. "She was seen walking near the old summer house before breakfast. Uncle Arthur was furious about it." "Why should that make him furious?" Lucy hesitated. "I don't know. Uncle Arthur is furious about many things." That was said lightly, but Miss Marple heard the strain beneath it. The household soon became too busy for private worries. By 11 o'clock, carriages and motor cars had begun arriving before the church. Ashcombe village had dressed itself for celebration. Bunting fluttered from cottage windows, children gathered near the gate, and several elderly ladies made comments about every guest's hat, with the seriousness of judges in court. The ceremony itself was lovely. Lucy walked down the aisle on her father's arm, pale but radiant. Daniel stood waiting at the altar, very still, his hands folded before him. When Lucy reached him, he looked at her with such sudden tenderness that even Miss Marple felt reassured. Whatever secrets surrounded Rosewood Hall, the young couple themselves seemed honestly attached. Arthur Bellamy sat in the front pew beside Eleanor. He looked dignified, almost severe. He did not turn when Emily slipped quietly into a side pew moments before the ceremony began. But Miss Marple noticed that Emily's gloved hands trembled. The vows were spoken. The register was signed. The church bells rang out joyfully over the village. For a little while, everything appeared exactly as it should. The wedding breakfast at Rosewood Hall was held in a great white marquee upon the lawn. Tables were decorated with roses and silver candlesticks. Champagne sparkled in tall glasses. The guests talked more loudly than usual, as people often do when they are determined to prove themselves happy. Miss Marple sat between a retired colonel with strong opinions about modern architecture and a young woman who was anxious to explain that she did not usually wear yellow. From her place, Miss Marple had a clear view of the top table. Lucy smiled dutifully at every speech. Daniel answered politely when spoken to, but his attention wandered more than once towards Arthur Bellamy. Arthur drank very little. His champagne glass remained almost untouched beside his plate. The photographer moved around the tables, taking pictures, or appearing to. Miss Marple watched him adjust his camera, point it towards a group, and press nothing. Twice he turned away just as someone smiled. Once he stood behind Arthur Bellamy for nearly half a minute, not photographing him, merely observing him. "That photographer fellow looks foreign," said the retired colonel in a whisper that could have reached France. "Does he?" said Miss Marple. "Or artistic. Same sort of thing, often." Miss Marple smiled. "Artists are sometimes very good observers." "Are they? And sometimes very good actors." The colonel looked puzzled, then attacked his salmon with renewed suspicion. After the meal came speeches. Lucy's father spoke warmly. Daniel's best man told amusing stories from university. Eleanor wiped her eyes once or twice. Then Arthur Bellamy rose. The tent became quieter. Arthur held no paper. He looked around at the guests with a faint expression of command. "My family," he began, "has not always been wise." A small movement passed through the top table. "Some mistakes," Arthur continued, "cannot be undone, but others may be put right, if one has the courage to face them." His eyes moved briefly to Emily, then to Daniel. Then, quite unexpectedly, to the photographer standing near the tent entrance. The photographer lowered his camera. Arthur smiled coldly. "I had intended to make a certain announcement today. However, I have decided it may wait until after the first dance." There was polite laughter, though few people understood why they were laughing. Arthur sat down. Daniel's face had gone pale. Emily looked as if she might faint. Miss Marple placed her napkin neatly beside her plate. "Interesting," she murmured. The afternoon passed into early evening. The wedding party moved indoors for music and dancing in the grand hall. The room had been decorated with garlands, candles, and white roses. A polished floor gleamed beneath the chandelier. Guests gathered around as Lucy and Daniel prepared for their first dance. Miss Marple stood near Eleanor, who was smiling at her granddaughter with shining eyes. "At least now the worst of the day is over," Eleanor whispered. Miss Marple did not answer. The musicians lifted their bows. Then all the lights went out. There was a gasp, then laughter, then confused voices in the darkness. Someone knocked over a chair. A woman cried out that her necklace had been caught. The darkness lasted only a few seconds. When the lights returned, the hall blinked back into brilliance. Lucy stood frozen in the center of the floor. Daniel was beside her. Eleanor pressed a hand to her throat. "Where is Arthur?" someone asked. At first, no one moved. Then Peter came running from the corridor that led to the library. "Doctor, quickly! Something's happened to Uncle Arthur." The music stopped. Guests rushed after him, though Miss Marple followed more slowly. The library door stood open. Arthur Bellamy lay on the carpet beside an overturned chair. One hand twisted beneath him, his face oddly peaceful. A book had fallen near his shoulder. The green-shaded reading lamp burned steadily upon the desk. The family doctor knelt beside him. After a moment, he looked up gravely. "I am afraid he is dead." A shocked silence filled the room. "His heart," whispered Eleanor. The doctor did not answer immediately. He bent closer, examining Arthur's neck and head. Then his expression changed. Miss Marple, standing near the door, saw the tiny mark just behind Arthur's ear. A mark so small most people would never have noticed it. The doctor rose very slowly. "No," he said, "I do not think this was his heart." The wedding guests stared at one another. Outside, the last bells of celebration faded over Ashcombe Village. Inside Rosewood Hall, joy had turned into fear. Miss Marple looked once at Arthur Bellamy, then at the open window, the untouched book, and the faint trace of soil upon the library carpet. "So," she said softly, almost sadly, "the wedding has truly begun." Chapter 3. Secrets Behind Smiling Faces. For several moments after the doctor's words, no one moved. The library at Rosewood Hall, which had always seemed a comfortable room full of polished wood, old books, and deep leather chairs, suddenly felt like a closed box. The wedding guests stood crowded near the doorway, their fine clothes and bright flowers strangely out of place beside death. Lucy gave a small cry, and Daniel caught her arm. Eleanor had gone very white. "Arthur," she whispered, as though her brother might answer if only she spoke gently enough. The doctor rose from beside the body. His name was Dr. Edmund Vale, a careful, tired-looking man with grey hair and a habit of rubbing his spectacles when troubled. "No one must touch anything," he said. "Inspector Reeves must be sent for at once." Peter, who had been standing nearest the door, nodded quickly. "I'll telephone the police." "Not from this room," said Miss Marple quietly. Peter stopped. Everyone looked at her. She gave a mild little smile. "I only mean that the telephone here may be of interest. It would be a pity to disturb anything before the inspector arrives." Dr. Vale glanced at her with surprise, then approval. "Quite right. Use the hall telephone." Peter hurried away. Miss Marple remained near the library door, not entering farther than necessary. She had no wish to appear important. In her experience, people who wished to appear important often missed the most important things. Her eyes moved quietly around the room. Arthur Bellamy lay beside the large writing desk, one arm bent beneath him. The chair beside him had been knocked over, but not broken. A book lay open upon the carpet, though its pages had not been creased by a fall. The lamp on the desk was lit. The window stood open a few inches, and on the carpet, near the French doors, there was mud. Not much, only a small smear and 2 faint marks. Miss Marple looked down at the shoes of those standing nearest her. Several pairs of polished wedding shoes. No mud. Interesting. Inspector Reeves arrived within half an hour. He was a strong, square-faced man, with steady eyes and a manner that suggested he disliked nonsense, but was not entirely immune to it. Behind him came a younger constable carrying a notebook. The inspector listened to Dr. Vale, examined the body, looked at the puncture mark behind Arthur's ear, and then ordered the room cleared. "No one is to leave Rosewood Hall," he announced. "I understand this is distressing, especially on such a day, but a man is dead, and the circumstances are suspicious." A murmur passed through the guests. "Suspicious?" Aunt Beatrice cried. She was Eleanor's sister-in-law, a large lady in lavender silk who had spent the morning complaining about lilies. "Inspector, surely you cannot mean murder. I mean that Mr. Bellamy did not die naturally." That silenced her. Miss Marple was led with the others into the drawing room. The wedding music had stopped. The flowers still decorated the hall. The great white cake stood untouched upon its table, absurdly cheerful beneath silver ribbons. People sat in little groups, speaking in whispers. Weddings, Miss Marple thought, brought out truth in people. Murder did the same, only more quickly. Eleanor sat beside her, trembling slightly. "Who could have done such a thing, Jane?" "My dear, that is exactly what we must not decide too soon." "But Arthur had enemies." "Most firm-minded people do." Eleanor looked at her. Miss Marple patted her hand. "That does not mean they are murdered every day." Inspector Reeves began his questioning with the family. Lucy was first. She sat straight-backed, still in her wedding gown, her veil removed and folded across her lap. Daniel stood behind her until the inspector asked him to wait outside. "When did you last see your uncle alive?" Reeves asked. "During the speeches. He said he would make an announcement after the first dance." "Did you know what announcement?" "No." Her answer came too quickly. Miss Marple, sitting quietly near the window with her knitting, noticed Daniel turn his head in the corridor beyond the half-open door. Inspector Reeves noticed too. "Are you certain, Mrs. Harper?" Lucy flushed at her new married name. "I thought it might concern the family trust. Uncle Arthur was always changing his mind about money." "And had that caused trouble?" Lucy hesitated. "Only ordinary family trouble." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. There was no such thing as ordinary family trouble. It was generally quite extraordinary to those inside it. Daniel was questioned next. He admitted he had been in debt the previous year, but claimed Arthur had already helped settle matters. "Why would he do that?" Reeves asked. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Because I was marrying Lucy." "Did he approve of the marriage?" "At first, no. Later, yes." "Why the change?" "I don't know." Again, too quick. When Daniel left the room, Emily entered. She looked calm, but her hands betrayed her. She kept smoothing the fingers of her gloves. Inspector Reeves asked where she had been during the blackout. "In the ballroom." "With everyone else?" "Yes." "Can anyone confirm that?" "I suppose so." "You argued with Mr. Bellamy yesterday evening." Emily looked sharply at him. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "It was not an argument. It was a private conversation." "About what?" "My late mother." The room seemed to become still. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Emily's voice remained quiet. "Uncle Arthur and my mother quarrelled many years ago. I wished to speak of it. He refused." "Was that why you came back from Canada?" Emily smiled faintly, without amusement. "I came back for Lucy's wedding." Miss Marple thought, partly true. Partial truth was often more useful than a complete lie. It showed where a person wished the wall to stand. The photographer was questioned after Emily. He gave his name as Mr. Lionel Gray. He was polite, neat, and composed. Too composed, perhaps. "You were hired by the bride's family?" asked Reeves. "By Mrs. Finch, through a London agency." "Had you ever visited Rosewood Hall before?" "No." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest second. Mr. Gray did not look towards her. "During the blackout, in the ballroom, near the musicians, I was changing a plate in my camera. Did you take any photographs at that moment? Unfortunately not. The darkness spoiled the shot. Convenient, said Inspector Reeves. Mr. Gray gave a small smile. For a photographer, Inspector, darkness is rarely convenient. It was a clever answer. Miss Marple mistrusted clever answers. They were often polished to hide scratches. By late evening, the first facts were known. Arthur Bellamy had left the ballroom shortly before the first dance. Several people had seen him move towards the library. No one admitted following him. The lights had failed for perhaps 15 seconds. When they returned, Arthur was already dead. Dr. Vale believed the tiny wound behind the ear had been made by a very fine needle or sharp instrument. There was no weapon found near the body. A servant reported that the library window had been closed earlier in the day. Another servant insisted it was open after dinner. The housekeeper discovered that one page had been torn from the wedding guest book, the page containing signatures from several late arrivals. Then, as if Rosewood Hall had not endured enough, a maid found a second anonymous note tucked beneath a silver tray in the servants' passage. Inspector Reeves read it aloud before the family. One secret has already been buried. Another soon will be. Aunt Beatrice nearly fainted, though she recovered quickly when someone mentioned smelling salts. The note threw the house into fresh panic. Peter insisted it proved some outsider had entered through the garden. Daniel said nothing. Lucy wept quietly. Emily turned her face away. The photographer watched everyone. Miss Marple watched the photographer. Later that night, Eleanor came to Miss Marple's room. She looked older than she had that morning. "Jane, I am frightened." "Yes, dear. Not only because Arthur is dead, because everyone is lying. I can feel it." Miss Marple poured her a little hot water with lemon. Most people lie when questioned by the police, even when they are innocent. Why? Because they are afraid the truth will make them look guilty. Eleanor sat heavily. "Do you suspect anyone?" Miss Marple looked towards the dark window. Beyond it, the garden was silent beneath the moon. "I suspect, my dear, that Arthur Bellamy was not killed because of what he owned." "Then why?" Miss Marple's face was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "Because of what he knew." Downstairs, somewhere in the sleeping house, a door closed softly. Neither woman spoke. Rosewood Hall, once filled with wedding laughter, now seemed to be listening. Chapter 4. The photograph that was missing. By breakfast the next morning, Rosewood Hall had changed completely. Only yesterday, it had been a house of ribbons, flowers, music, and laughter. Now the white roses drooped in their vases, the wedding cake remained untouched beneath its silver knife, and the guests moved about in low voices, as if the walls themselves might accuse them. Miss Marple came down early, wearing a pale wool shawl and carrying her knitting bag. She found Eleanor in the morning room, staring at a cup of tea that had gone quite cold. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you must eat something." "I cannot." "Then pretend you can. It often has much the same effect." Eleanor gave a weak smile. "You always make common sense sound like wisdom." "It usually is wisdom, only less grand." Before Eleanor could reply, Inspector Reeves entered with his notebook in hand. His face was grave but not unkind. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Finch, I must ask a few more questions." "Of course," said Eleanor. The inspector looked at Miss Marple. "I understand you noticed mud in the library." "I noticed a little soil," she corrected mildly. "Soil? Mud is usually from outside. Soil may be from a flower pot." Inspector Reeves studied her. "You think the mark came from inside the house?" "I think it would be unwise to decide too quickly that someone entered through the garden." The inspector was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We found the library window scratched near the catch. It may have been forced." "Or made to look forced," said Miss Marple. Eleanor shivered. "Jane, that sounds worse." "It is sometimes worse when things are arranged too neatly." Inspector Reeves closed his notebook. "I have sent for information about Mr. Lionel Gray, the photographer. The London agency confirms he was hired properly, but there is some delay in confirming his history. I also want to know why the guest book page disappeared." "Did it contain Mr. Gray's signature?" asked Miss Marple. The inspector looked surprised. "It did." "Ah, why do you say that?" "No reason yet. Only a small thought looking for somewhere to sit down." Inspector Reeves almost smiled. After he left, Miss Marple asked Eleanor whether Rosewood Hall kept old family albums. "Albums? Yes, dozens of them. In the small sitting room upstairs. Why? Because families often hide their most useful secrets in the open, pasted neatly beneath photographs. Eleanor led her upstairs to a quiet room overlooking the east lawn. It was a room seldom used now, filled with faded chairs, a writing desk, and shelves of photograph albums bound in dark green leather. For the next hour, Miss Marple turned pages slowly. There were pictures of garden parties, Christmas gatherings, christenings, school holidays, and stiff family portraits in which no one looked particularly comfortable. Eleanor sat nearby, occasionally naming faces. That is my brother Arthur at 20, already rather sure of himself. There is my sister Clara. Poor Clara, she died young. That little girl is Emily with her mother. Miss Marple paused. Emily's mother appeared several times, a gentle-looking woman with serious eyes. In one photograph she stood beside a young man who was not identified. "Who is that gentleman?" Miss Marple asked. Eleanor leaned forward. "I do not remember. Not family. I don't think so." The photograph showed a summer picnic near Rosewood Hall. Arthur stood in the background. Emily's mother sat beneath a tree. Beside her stood the unknown young man, smiling down at her in a way that suggested more than friendship. Miss Marple turned the page. The next photograph was missing. Only 4 little corner marks remained, pale against the old paper. "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple. Eleanor frowned. "Someone has removed it." "Yes, but why?" That is usually the question when people remove photographs. A missing photograph often speaks louder than one left behind. They searched the following albums. There were no more pictures of the unknown young man. At last, Eleanor sighed. "I had forgotten all this. There was an engagement once, many years ago. Not Lucy's, of course. Someone else in the family. It ended badly." "Whose engagement?" Eleanor pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Clara's, I think. Or perhaps a cousin's. Arthur never allowed it to be discussed. He said the man was unsuitable." "Unsuitable is a very useful word," said Miss Marple. "It can mean poor, foreign, honest, inconvenient, or merely disliked." Eleanor looked troubled. "Jane, do you think Arthur ruined someone's life?" Miss Marple closed the album. "My dear, I think Arthur was a man who believed he had the right to arrange other people's lives. Such men are often surprised when those people remember." Later that morning, Inspector Reeves questioned the servants again while Miss Marple walked through the conservatory. It was a warm glass room, filled with ferns, palms, and large pots of lilies left over from the wedding decorations. The air smelled damp and sweet. Near one stand of white flowers, Miss Marple noticed a small gap in the soil of a heavy pot. Something had recently been pushed in and pulled out. She bent carefully. A smear of dark soil marked the edge of the tiled floor. The same colour, she thought, as the mark in the library. A footman entered with a watering can and nearly dropped it when he saw her. "Oh, beg pardon, miss." "No need to beg," said Miss Marple. "Watering flowers is a blameless occupation." He smiled nervously. "Only everyone is that upset, miss." "Naturally. Did anyone come into the conservatory last night?" "Lots, miss. During the reception. Guests walking about, some wanting air. Mr. Daniel came in once. Miss Emily too. And that photographer gentleman, setting up his camera near the palms. Did Mr. Arthur come here?" The footman hesitated. "I saw him near the door, miss, talking to someone." "Whom?" "I couldn't rightly see. There were flowers in the way." Flowers, Miss Marple reflected, were very pretty, but they had a bad habit of helping people hide. In the afternoon, another disturbance shook the house. Lucy discovered that a small silver bracelet, one she had meant to wear after the ceremony, had vanished from her dressing table. It was not valuable compared with the family jewels, but Lucy became strangely distressed. "It belonged to my mother," she told Miss Marple. "I know I left it there." Daniel tried to comfort her, but his face showed more worry than sympathy. Aunt Beatrice declared that servants were not what they used to be. The housekeeper took offence. Peter insisted the theft proved an outsider had entered. Emily said nothing, but Miss Marple noticed her glance quickly towards Daniel. That evening, Inspector Reeves received news from London. The photography agency had no reason to suspect Lionel Gray. His papers were correct. His references were acceptable. Yet he had joined the agency only 6 months before and had supplied very little personal history before that. "A man may change professions," said the inspector. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "and sometimes names." The inspector looked at her sharply. "You think Gray is false?" I think he is careful. False people are often careful, but careful people are not always false. Reeves sighed. That is not a simple answer. Murder rarely is. As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned once more to the upstairs sitting room. She had remembered something about the missing photograph, something not in the picture itself, but in the pale marks where it had been. She opened the album again. The missing photograph had been larger than the others. A formal group, perhaps. Tucked deep between the pages, almost hidden in the spine, was a tiny torn corner of photographic paper. Miss Marple drew it out. It showed only part of a man's sleeve, and a hand resting on the back of a chair. On the hand was a signet ring, not Arthur's ring. She slipped the fragment into her knitting bag. Just then, a sound came from the corridor. A board creaked. Someone was standing outside the door. Miss Marple looked up calmly. "Do come in," she said. There was a silence. Then hurried footsteps retreated down the passage. Miss Marple waited until they faded. Only then did she close the album. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck 8. Somewhere in Rosewood Hall, someone knew a photograph was missing, and someone was very anxious that it should remain so. Chapter 5. The Diary in the Locked Desk. By the third morning after the wedding, Rosewood Hall had taken on the strange air of a place waiting for judgment. The guests remained because Inspector Reeves had requested it, but no one now pretended they were enjoying a family gathering. The bright wedding clothes had been put away. Black, grey, and dark blue appeared at breakfast. Voices were lowered, eyes avoided one another. The house had become full of small silences. Miss Marple, however, appeared as calm as ever. She sat in the morning room beside the window, knitting a pale pink baby jacket for a neighbour in St. Mary Mead. The soft wool moved steadily through her fingers, while everyone around her looked increasingly uncomfortable. Inspector Reeves entered shortly after 9 o'clock. "I have been through Mr. Bellamy's papers," he said. "At least, the papers in the library desk." "At least," Miss Marple repeated gently. "There is another desk in his bedroom, locked. The key is missing." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Arthur always kept his private diary there." "A diary?" asked the inspector. "Yes, he wrote in it every evening. Not feelings, you understand. Arthur was not a man for feelings, but appointments, meetings, conversations, things he wished to remember." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A very dangerous habit." Inspector Reeves looked at her. "Dangerous? Only for people who hoped he would forget." The inspector sent a constable to search for the missing key. Meanwhile, he continued questioning the household. Everyone was now tired enough to make mistakes, which Miss Marple considered useful. A fresh liar often tells a neat story. A tired liar leaves edges showing. The first edge appeared when Peter was questioned again. He admitted that he had been near the library corridor during the blackout. "I was looking for Uncle Arthur," he said. "Why?" asked Reeves. "Because I wanted to speak to him. About money." Peter's face reddened. "Yes." It emerged that Peter had invested badly in a small motor business and owed a considerable sum. Arthur had refused to help him. "So you had reason to resent him," said the inspector. "Lots of people resented Uncle Arthur," Peter replied bitterly. "That does not make us murderers." "No," Miss Marple murmured from her chair. "Only human." Peter looked at her, unsure whether he had been defended or criticized. Next came Aunt Beatrice, who had spent 2 days claiming she knew nothing about anything. Under Inspector Reeves's steady questioning, she finally admitted that Arthur had planned to change his will. "He told me so himself," she said, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief that remained quite dry. "He said certain people were no longer deserving." "Which people?" He did not say. But Miss Marple noticed that Aunt Beatrice glanced towards Emily before answering. Then Daniel was called. The young bridegroom looked exhausted. His marriage had begun with murder, suspicion, and public humiliation. Yet beneath his distress, Miss Marple saw something else. Fear. Not grief. Fear. Inspector Reeves placed a silver bracelet on the table. "Do you recognize this?" Lucy, who had been sitting beside Eleanor, gave a gasp. "My bracelet. Where did you find it?" "In Mr. Harper's travelling case." All eyes turned towards Daniel. He stood very still. "Daniel," Lucy whispered. "I didn't steal it," he said. "Then how did it get there?" asked Reeves. "I don't know. It was an unfortunate answer, because innocent men often said it badly, and guilty men said it better." Lucy began to cry. Daniel stepped towards her. but she drew back. The gesture hurt him more visibly than any accusation. Miss Marple watched carefully. Pain, she thought, can be genuine even when truth is not. After Daniel left, Eleanor turned to Miss Marple in distress. "Jane, surely Daniel cannot have killed Arthur for a bracelet." "No, dear, I should think not." "Then why was it in his case? Perhaps because someone wished it to be found there. To make him look guilty? Or to frighten him into silence?" Eleanor stared at her. "Silence about what?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "That is what someone is very anxious we should not discover." By afternoon, the missing key had still not been found. Inspector Reeves ordered Arthur's bedroom desk to be opened by force. The family gathered unwillingly in the room while the constable worked at the lock. The desk was a fine old piece of furniture, dark wood with brass handles. Its drawers smelled faintly of cedar and dust. At last, the lock gave way. Inside were letters, legal papers, a sealed envelope, and a small black diary. Inspector Reeves opened the diary with care. Several pages contained ordinary notes. Dinner with Vale, letter from solicitor, talk with Lucy. Then, on the page dated the day before the wedding, one sentence stood out. "The past has returned wearing a new face." The room became very quiet. Inspector Reeves read the line again. "A new face," he said slowly. Emily's colour changed. Daniel looked down. The photographer, Mr. Lionel Gray, who had been summoned with the others, showed no reaction at all. That interested Miss Marple most. People who feel nothing usually show something. People who feel too much often show nothing. The inspector continued turning pages. The final entry, written only hours before Arthur's death, was brief. "After the first dance, I shall tell them. It has gone on long enough." "Tell them what?" Lucy whispered. No one answered. At the back of the desk, beneath a stack of old bills, the constable discovered a torn hotel receipt. It was 20 years old, yellowed with age, and bore the name of a seaside hotel in Devon. Eleanor frowned. Why would Arthur keep that? Miss Marple leaned forward. "May I see it?" Inspector Reeves handed it to her. The receipt was made out to a Mr. Thomas Lyle. "Do you know the name?" asked Reeves. Eleanor shook her head. But Emily suddenly gripped the back of a chair. "Emily?" asked Lucy. "It is nothing," Emily said quickly. Too quickly, the inspector noticed. "Miss Emily, I think you had better explain." Emily's calm finally broke. "My mother once mentioned that name," she said. "Only once. She was ill, and perhaps she did not know what she was saying." "What did she say?" Emily looked at Eleanor, then at the floor. "She said Thomas Lyle was the only honest man she had ever loved." Aunt Beatrice gave a small, shocked sound. Eleanor covered her mouth. Miss Marple's face remained gentle, but her eyes grew sharper. The missing photograph, the old engagement. Arthur's control, a man removed from family history. Pieces, but not yet a picture. That evening, as rain began tapping against the windows, Miss Marple walked alone towards the upstairs sitting room. She wished to examine the albums once more. Halfway along the corridor, she saw a thin strip of light beneath the door. Someone was already inside. She opened the door quietly. A figure stood near the shelves, holding the green photograph album. At the sound of her entrance, the person started violently. The album slipped, struck the floor, and several loose papers scattered. It was Lucy. Her face was pale. "Miss Marple, I was only looking for a photograph of my mother." "Were you, dear?" Lucy bent quickly to gather the papers, but Miss Marple was faster than she appeared. She noticed one folded sheet half hidden beneath the chair. It bore Arthur's handwriting. Lucy saw it at the same moment. For a breath, neither moved. Then, from downstairs, there came a crash. A scream followed. Both women ran. In the hall below, servants and guests were gathering beneath the great chandelier. One of its heavy crystal branches had fallen and shattered across the floor. Directly beneath it stood Miss Marple's walking stick, broken cleanly in two. Eleanor rushed towards her. "Jane, you might have been killed." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. She looked up at the chandelier, then around at the shocked faces. Someone in the house had made a mistake. They had not frightened Miss Marple. They had warned her, and now she knew that the truth was very close indeed. Chapter 6. Miss Marple reveals the truth. The following morning dawned grey and quiet. Rain had washed the gardens of Rosewood Hall during the night, leaving every leaf sparkling beneath the pale sunlight. Yet inside the house, The atmosphere had become heavier than ever. No one spoke of returning home. No one spoke of the wedding. Everyone waited. Miss Marple finished her breakfast, folded her napkin neatly, and turned to Inspector Reeves. "I wonder," she said pleasantly, "whether you might gather everyone together in the drawing room after luncheon." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You have reached a conclusion?" "I believe so." "You are certain?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear inspector, one is never absolutely certain until someone confesses, but one may become very comfortable with one's conclusions." Inspector Reeves studied her face. "Very well." By 2 o'clock, the entire household had assembled. Lucy sat beside Daniel, though there was still sadness between them. Eleanor looked anxious. Emily stood quietly near the fireplace. Peter leaned against the window. Aunt Beatrice clutched a handkerchief. Dr. Vale waited beside Inspector Reeves. At the back of the room stood Mr. Lionel Gray, the wedding photographer, holding his camera case. Miss Marple remained seated in a comfortable armchair. She looked around the room with the calm expression of a schoolteacher preparing to explain a lesson. "My dear friends," she began softly, "I think we have all been looking at this case from the wrong direction." Nobody spoke. "We have spent 3 days asking who wished Arthur Bellamy dead because of money." She shook her head. "But money explains very little." Inspector Reeves nodded. "Go on." "Arthur Bellamy was not murdered because of his fortune." She looked towards Arthur's empty chair. "He was murdered because he recognized someone." Several faces changed expression. Daniel frowned. Lucy looked puzzled. Peter stared openly. Miss Marple continued. "Arthur himself told us so." She picked up the black diary. In his final entry he wrote, "The past has returned wearing a new face." She allowed the words to settle. Those are not the words of a man worrying about inheritance. They are the words of someone who has recognized an old enemy. Emily looked suddenly pale. "You mean Thomas Lyle?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely." The room became silent. Eleanor whispered, "But Thomas Lyle disappeared 20 years ago." "Yes." "Arthur ended Clara's engagement to him," Emily said quietly. "So I believe." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Arthur believed Thomas Lyle unworthy of the family. Whether he was right or wrong hardly matters now. What matters is that a young man's future was destroyed." Inspector Reeves asked, "But Thomas Lyle is long gone." "Perhaps." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Or perhaps only his name disappeared." Everyone stared at her. She turned her eyes towards the photographer. "Mr. Gray." The photographer smiled politely. "Yes, Miss Marple?" "I do not believe your name is Lionel Gray." The smile remained. "I assure you it is." "I do not think so." Inspector Reeves stood straighter. "Miss Marple," she continued calmly, "the missing photograph first interested me because someone had deliberately removed it." She lifted the torn photograph fragment she had found. It showed only part of a man's hand wearing a signet ring. She looked directly at the photographer. "You wear that same ring." Almost unconsciously, his right hand closed. It was only a tiny movement. Miss Marple saw it. So did Inspector Reeves. "You removed the photograph because it showed you many years ago." The photographer laughed quietly. "Really, Miss Marple, I thought at first that you might actually be Thomas Lyle." She shook her head. "But that was impossible." Everyone waited. Thomas Lyle would now be much older. She smiled kindly. "You are not Thomas Lyle." The photographer's smile weakened. "You are his son." No one moved. Lucy covered her mouth. Peter stared in disbelief. Even Inspector Reeves seemed surprised. Miss Marple continued quietly. "Arthur recognized your face because you resemble your father." She turned another page of Arthur's diary. "He recognized you during the speeches." She looked back at the photographer. "That is why Arthur intended to make an announcement after the first dance." Inspector Reeves asked, "What announcement?" Miss Marple answered, "He intended to tell the family who the photographer really was." She looked once again at Mr. Gray. "Your real surname is Lyle." For the first time, the photographer said nothing. His calm expression had disappeared. Inspector Reeves stepped closer. "Is that true?" Still no answer. Miss Marple continued, "You accepted the wedding assignment under a false identity because it gave you free access to Rosewood Hall." She pointed towards the camera case. "You carried more than cameras." Inspector Reeves opened the case. Inside were lenses, plates, and hidden beneath a false compartment, a slender metal tube fitted with a tiny spring-loaded needle. Dr. Vale immediately recognized it. The wound. Inspector Reeves lifted the device carefully. This could certainly have caused it. Miss Marple nodded. Arthur refused to drink his champagne. Everyone looked confused. "I beg your pardon?" asked Eleanor. "The untouched glass." Miss Marple smiled. Everyone assumed it was meaningless. It was not. The murderer expected poison in the champagne to solve everything quietly. She turned towards the photographer, but Arthur never drank it. The photographer's face remained expressionless. "So when the lights failed," Miss Marple continued, "he followed Arthur into the library and used the concealed needle." Inspector Reeves frowned. "But how did he arrange the blackout?" Peter suddenly spoke. "The photographer asked where the electrical cupboard was while setting up extra lights." Miss Marple nodded. "He had every excuse to examine the house beforehand." Inspector Reeves looked back at the silent man. "And the missing guestbook page?" Miss Marple answered before anyone else. "He signed his real surname before remembering himself." She held up the recovered page. The page contained the name Lyle. A gasp travelled around the room. The murderer tore it out immediately. Inspector Reeves slowly unfolded the page. There it was. One signature. Leonard Lyle. The photographer closed his eyes. Only for a second. When he opened them again, the pretense had vanished. "My father," he said quietly, "lost everything because of Arthur Bellamy." No one interrupted. He loved Clara Bellamy. Emily lowered her head. They planned to marry. Arthur ruined him. His voice became harder. He spread lies. He destroyed father's business. He forced Clara to leave. My father spent the rest of his life believing she had abandoned him. He looked around the room. When I learned the truth after father's death, I decided Arthur Bellamy would finally answer for it. Lucy whispered, "So you came here to watch him lose everything?" Inspector Reeves stepped forward. "And murdered him." Leonard Lyle gave a tired smile. "Yes." The room remained silent. At last he quietly held out his hands. "I suppose there is no point pretending any longer." The constable placed him under arrest. As he was led from the room, Leonard paused beside Emily. "I never meant any harm to the rest of you." Emily answered sadly, "Revenge never stops where it begins." The door closed behind him. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Inspector Reeves turned to Miss Marple. "I followed every clue." "So did I," she replied. "Yet I missed the truth." "You were looking for a murderer," Miss Marple said gently. "I was looking at people." The inspector smiled. "I suspect that is why you solved it." Lucy reached for Daniel's hand. This time she did not let go. Eleanor looked out towards the gardens where the wedding flowers still bloomed, despite everything that had happened. Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting. As the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, she said with her familiar gentle smile, "It is curious how often people believe the past is finished with them. In my experience, the past is remarkably patient. It waits very quietly until someone opens the wrong door." Outside, the church bells rang once more across the village. This time, there was no mystery left unanswered.
If you enjoy our story, then like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.